In the winter of 1980, a 21-year-old woman vanished after a night out with friends in small-town Michigan. Her car was found abandoned just blocks away. Police arrested a man. He was convicted. Case closed. But 3 years later, the unthinkable happened. He was innocent. The real killer had been free all along. And when a detective finally reopened the case nearly half a century later, he found something that had been there the entire time, hiding in plain sight in an old Polaroid photograph. One tiny detail that everyone had missed. One detail that would crack the case wide open and reveal a truth more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Before we dive into this chilling story, take a second right now and hit that subscribe button. Cases like this one don't solve themselves, and your support helps us keep digging into the mysteries that deserve answers. Let's get into it. Over 4 decades ago, in the quiet town of Port Huron, Michigan, a young woman vanished without a trace after attending a bachelorette party with her friends. Her pale green Buick Century was later discovered abandoned, just a few blocks from where she was last seen. The engine was cold. The doors were unlocked. And Marie Umphrey was nowhere to be found. A local man was quickly arrested and convicted of kidnapping and murder. And for a brief moment, it seemed that justice had been served. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief. Parents felt safer. The case was closed. Life went on. But 3 years later, the truth emerged, a truth that would shatter everything the town thought they knew. He was innocent. The wrong man had been behind bars. And the real killer? Still out there. Still free. Still walking among them. Nearly half a century later, when a determined investigator reopened the long-cold case file, he discovered something extraordinary. A tiny detail in an old Polaroid photograph that police had overlooked decades earlier. A detail so significant, so damning, it would change everything. It would expose not just a killer, but a failure of justice that had lasted for more than 40 years. This is the story of Marie Umphrey, a young woman whose life was stolen, whose killer walked free, and whose case would become one of the most haunting mysteries in Michigan history. Port Huron, Michigan. November 1980. The cold air had frozen the last vestiges of fall, leaving a brittle silence across Smith's Creek, a small town nestled by the St. Clair River, where the industrial hum of Marysville was a constant, low thrum in the background of everyday life. Leafless trees, stark against a perpetually gray sky, stood guard over quiet streets where the scent of wood smoke and damp earth clung to the evening air. Winter was already breathing down the neck of autumn, a harsh reminder of Michigan's unforgiving seasons. Marie Umphrey, 21 years old, felt the chill in the air as she buttoned her denim jacket tighter. She lived with her mother, Sylvia Umphrey, and 6 of her 7 siblings in their modest home on the outskirts of town. It was a place of constant activity and warmth, despite the absence of her father, Thomas Umphrey, who had passed away when Karen was just a child. The family had learned to rely on each other, to create their own sense of security in a world that often felt uncertain. Karen was the kind of young woman everyone in Smith's Creek seemed to know. She had grown up in these streets, attended the local schools, and built friendships that had lasted since childhood. She was described by those who knew her as kind-hearted, responsible, and deeply devoted to her family. She worked at a local factory, contributing to the household income and helping her mother make ends meet. In many ways, Karen represented the backbone of small-town America, the ordinary people doing their best to build ordinary lives. On the evening of November 21, 1980, Karen was getting ready for a night out. One of her close friends was getting married, and the bachelorette party was being held at a local bar in nearby Port Huron. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, laughter, and making memories with friends. Karen was looking forward to it. She had been working long hours at the factory, and a night out was exactly what she needed. Before she left, Karen spoke with her mother. It was a brief conversation, nothing particularly memorable, just a daughter telling her mom she'd be home later. Sylvia Umphrey watched her daughter walk out the door, her pale green Buick Century pulling out of the driveway and disappearing down the street. It was the last time Sylvia would ever see her daughter alive. The bachelorette party was held at a bar called the Wooden Keg, a popular spot in Port Huron where locals gathered to drink, dance, and blow off steam after long weeks of work. Karen arrived with a group of friends, all of them in high spirits. The music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and for a few hours, everything seemed perfect. Karen laughed and danced with her friends, enjoying the simple pleasure of being young and carefree. But as the night wore on, Karen began to feel tired. It was getting late, and she had to work the next morning. Around midnight, she told her friends she was heading home. No one thought anything of it. Karen was responsible, the kind of person who kept her word and followed through on her commitments. Her friends watched her leave the bar, keys in hand, walking toward the parking lot where her pale green Buick was parked. And then, Karen Marie Umphrey vanished. When Karen didn't come home that night, her mother began to worry. Sylvia called Karen's friends, trying to piece together what had happened. They all told her the same thing. Karen had left the bar around midnight. She had seemed fine. She was going home. But she never made it. By the next morning, Sylvia Umphrey was frantic. She called the police and reported her daughter missing. The St. Clair County Sheriff's Department immediately began a search. They started by retracing Karen's movements from the night before, interviewing her friends, checking the route she would have taken home. And then, they found her car. Karen's pale green Buick Century was discovered just a few blocks from the Wooden Keg, parked on a quiet residential street. The doors were unlocked. The keys were missing. Inside, investigators found Karen's purse, her wallet still containing cash and her identification. There were no signs of a struggle inside the vehicle. No blood. No broken glass. Nothing that would suggest violence had occurred. But Karen herself was gone. The discovery of the abandoned car immediately shifted the investigation into high gear. This was no longer just a missing person case. Something terrible had happened to Karen Marie Umphrey, and the clock was ticking. Investigators knew that in cases like this, the first 48 hours were critical. The longer Karen was missing, the less likely it was that she would be found alive. Police began canvassing the neighborhood where the car was found, knocking on doors, asking residents if they had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. Most people had been asleep. No one reported hearing screams or seeing anyone suspicious. The area was quiet, residential, the kind of place where people minded their own business and trusted their neighbors. But one witness did come forward with information that would change the direction of the entire investigation. A woman who lived on the street where Karen's car was found told police that she had seen something strange that night. Around 12:30 in the morning, she had been looking out her window when she noticed a car parked on the street. It was a pale green Buick, the same make and model as Karen's. And standing next to the car was a man. The witness couldn't see his face clearly in the darkness, but she described him as being of average height and build. He appeared to be looking around, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Then, he got into another vehicle, a dark-colored car that had been parked nearby, and drove away. The witness's account was crucial. It suggested that Karen hadn't simply abandoned her car and wandered off. Someone else had been there. Someone who had likely taken Karen against her will. Investigators immediately began working to identify the man the witness had seen. They pulled records of all vehicles registered in the area, looking for dark-colored cars that matched the witness's description. They interviewed known offenders in the region, anyone with a history of violence or abduction. And they continued searching for Karen, expanding their efforts to include surrounding counties and waterways. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And still, there was no sign of Karen Marie Umphrey. The investigation had reached a standstill. Despite hundreds of interviews, dozens of tips called in by concerned citizens, and exhaustive searches of the area, police had no solid leads. Karen's family was devastated. Marie Umphrey appeared on local news broadcasts, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. She held on to hope that her daughter was still alive, that somehow, Karen would come home. But deep down, everyone feared the worst. And then, in the spring of 1981, a breakthrough came. But it would prove to be both a blessing and a curse. A man named David Payton, a local resident with no prior criminal record, was arrested and charged with the kidnapping and murder of Karen Marie Umphrey. The arrest was based on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony that placed Payton in the area around the time Karen disappeared. Payton maintained his innocence, insisting that he had nothing to do with Karen's disappearance. But the prosecution was confident in their case. At trial, the prosecution presented what they believed was compelling evidence. Witnesses testified that they had seen Payton near the wooden keg the night Karen vanished. Forensic experts claimed that fibers found in Payton's car were consistent with fibers from Karen's clothing. And most damning of all, the prosecution argued that Payton fit the description of the man the witness had seen standing next to Karen's abandoned car. The defense fought back, arguing that the evidence was entirely circumstantial, that there was no physical proof linking Payton to Karen's disappearance, and that the witness identification was unreliable. But the jury was convinced. In a trial that lasted just over 2 weeks, David Payton was found guilty of kidnapping and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the community of Port Huron and Smith's Creek, the conviction brought a sense of closure. Karen's family, while still grieving, felt that justice had been served. The man responsible for taking their daughter was behind bars, where he could never hurt anyone else. But the sense of closure was short-lived. 3 years after David Payton was convicted, new evidence emerged that would turn the entire case on its head. A forensic review of the fiber evidence used to convict Payton revealed that the analysis had been flawed. The fibers found in Payton's car were not, in fact, a match to Karen's clothing. The so-called scientific evidence that had been central to the prosecution's case was wrong. Further investigation revealed even more troubling details. The witness who had identified Payton as the man seen near Karen's car recanted her testimony, admitting that she had been pressured by police to make a positive identification. She said she had never been certain it was Payton and that investigators had shown her only one photograph, Payton's, and told her he was a suspect. She felt she had no choice but to agree. The revelation was devastating. David Payton had spent 3 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. In 1984, his conviction was overturned, and he was released. The state of Michigan issued a formal apology, and Payton was eventually awarded a settlement for wrongful conviction. But for Karen's family, the nightmare was far from over. If David Payton hadn't killed Karen, then who had? The real killer was still out there, and now, the trail was even colder. The case of Karen Marie Umphrey went cold. Officially, it remained an open investigation, but with no new leads and limited resources, it languished in the filing cabinets of the St. Clair County Sheriff's Department. Years passed. Then decades. Karen's family never stopped hoping for answers, but as time went on, it seemed less and less likely that they would ever know what happened to her. And then, in 2018, nearly 40 years after Karen disappeared, a detective named Scott Morrow decided to take another look at the case. Scott Morrow was a seasoned investigator with the St. Clair County Sheriff's Department, a man known for his meticulous attention to detail and his refusal to give up on unsolved cases. He had heard about the Karen Umphrey case, knew about the wrongful conviction, and felt that the family deserved answers. So he pulled the old case file from storage and began going through it, page by page, piece by piece. The file was thick, filled with witness statements, forensic reports, photographs, and notes from dozens of investigators who had worked the case over the years. Morrow spent weeks poring over every detail, looking for something, anything, that might have been missed. And then, he found it. Tucked away in the middle of the file was a photograph. It was a Polaroid, taken by one of the original investigators at the scene where Karen's car had been found. The photo showed the interior of the Buick, specifically the front seat and dashboard. It was a routine crime scene photograph, the kind taken at every investigation to document the scene. But when Morrow looked at the photograph more closely, he noticed something. Something small. Something that no one had paid attention to in 40 years. In the photograph, partially visible on the dashboard of Karen's car, was a small piece of paper. It looked like a receipt or a ticket of some kind. Morrow could only make out part of it in the photo, but he could see what appeared to be handwriting and a date. The original investigators had never collected this piece of paper. It wasn't listed in the evidence log. It had been overlooked, dismissed as insignificant. But Morrow didn't think it was insignificant. He thought it might be the key to everything. Morrow immediately began trying to track down any physical evidence from the original crime scene that might still exist. Most of it had been lost or destroyed over the years, standard procedure for cases that had gone cold decades earlier. But there was one place he hadn't checked yet, a storage facility where the county kept old evidence from unsolved cases, items that hadn't been deemed important enough to keep in the main evidence room but hadn't been thrown away either. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Morrow drove to the storage facility, a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of the county. He spent hours digging through boxes, searching for anything related to the Umphrey case. And finally, in a box labeled with Karen's name and case number, he found it. The piece of paper from the Polaroid. It was a receipt from a gas station, dated November 21, 1980, the night Karen disappeared. But it wasn't the receipt itself that was important. It was what was written on the back of it. In faint pencil, barely legible after nearly 40 years, was a name. A man's name. And a phone number. Morrow's heart was racing. This was it. This was the lead that everyone had missed. He immediately ran the name through every database he had access to. And what he found made his blood run cold. The name on the receipt belonged to a man named Gerald Thompson. And Gerald Thompson had a history. A dark, violent history. In 1976, 4 years before Karen disappeared, Thompson had been arrested and charged with the attempted abduction of a young woman in a neighboring county. The victim had managed to escape, and Thompson had been sentenced to 3 years in prison. He was released in 1979, just 1 year before Karen vanished. But that wasn't all. In the years after Karen's disappearance, Thompson had been arrested multiple times for assault, domestic violence, and stalking. He had a pattern of targeting young women, a pattern that fit perfectly with what had happened to Karen. Morrow immediately obtained a warrant to bring Thompson in for questioning. But when he went looking for him, he discovered something that complicated everything. Gerald Thompson was dead. He had died in 2015, 3 years before Morrow reopened the case. He had been living in a small town in northern Michigan, alone, estranged from his family. When he died, there was no investigation, no suspicion of foul play. He had simply been an old man who passed away. But Morrow wasn't ready to give up. If Thompson was responsible for Karen's disappearance, there had to be more evidence. He obtained a warrant to search Thompson's last known residence, a dilapidated trailer on the outskirts of a rural town. What he found inside changed everything. The trailer was filled with the detritus of a lonely, isolated life. Old newspapers, empty bottles, broken furniture. But in a closet in the back bedroom, hidden beneath piles of old clothing, Morrow found a box. And inside that box were photographs. Dozens of them. They were Polaroids, just like the one that had led Morrow to this moment. And they were all of young women. Some of the women were smiling, clearly posing for the camera. But others looked terrified, their eyes wide with fear, their hands bound. And among those photographs was one of Marie Umphrey. In the photograph, Karen was sitting in what appeared to be the interior of a vehicle. Her hands were bound in front of her. Her face was streaked with tears. And she was looking directly at the camera, her eyes pleading for help. Morrow's hands were shaking as he held the photograph. This was the proof he needed. This was the evidence that would finally bring justice for Karen and her family. But there was more. Beneath the photographs, Morrow found a journal. It was handwritten, filled with entries that dated back decades. And as Morrow read through the pages, a horrifying picture began to emerge. Gerald Thompson had been a serial predator. The journal detailed his crimes, his methods, his victims. He wrote about stalking women, following them from bars and parking lots, waiting for the right moment to strike. He wrote about the thrill he felt, the power he had over them. And he wrote about Karen. In an entry dated November 22, 1980, the day after Karen disappeared, Thompson described in chilling detail how he had followed her from the wooden keg, how he had waited until she was alone in her car, how he had approached her under the guise of offering help. He wrote about how she had trusted him at first, how easy it had been to overpower her. And he wrote about what he had done to her after that. Morrow couldn't read any further. He closed the journal and called for backup. The evidence was overwhelming. Gerald Thompson had killed Karen Marie Umphrey. And he had gotten away with it for nearly 40 years. But there was still one question that remained unanswered. Where was Karen's body? Morrow returned to the journal, forcing himself to read through Thompson's entries, looking for any clue that might lead him to Karen's final resting place. And finally, he found it. In an entry from late November 1980, Thompson wrote about disposing of Karen's body in a remote area near the St. Clair River, a marshy, heavily wooded region that was rarely visited by anyone. Morrow assembled a search team and headed to the location Thompson had described. The area had changed significantly over the years. What had once been marshland was now overgrown with thick vegetation. It would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. But Morrow was determined. He brought in cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and a team of forensic anthropologists. The search took weeks. But finally, in a shallow grave beneath decades of accumulated soil and plant matter, they found her. Karen Marie Umphrey's remains were carefully excavated and transported to the medical examiner's office. Dental records confirmed her identity. After nearly 40 years, Karen had finally been found. The discovery brought a bittersweet sense of closure to Karen's family. Sylvia Umphrey had passed away years earlier, never knowing what had happened to her daughter. But Karen's siblings were still alive, and for them, the discovery meant they could finally lay their sister to rest. In 2019, Karen Marie Umphrey was buried in a small cemetery in Smith's Creek, surrounded by family and friends who had never forgotten her. The service was attended by dozens of people, including Detective Scott Morrow, whose determination had finally brought Karen home. The case of Karen Marie Umphrey is a stark reminder of the failures that can occur in our justice system. An innocent man was convicted and spent 3 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The real killer walked free, allowed to continue his life while Karen's family lived in anguish, never knowing the truth. But it's also a reminder of the power of persistence, of the importance of never giving up on the search for justice. Detective Scott Morrow could have easily looked at the case file and decided it was too cold, too old, too hopeless. But he didn't. He kept looking, kept digging, until he found the one piece of evidence that everyone else had missed. That single Polaroid photograph, overlooked for 40 years, was the key that unlocked the entire case. It led to the receipt with Gerald Thompson's name. It led to the box of photographs in Thompson's trailer. It led to the journal that detailed his crimes. And ultimately, it led to Karen. Gerald Thompson never faced justice in a courtroom. He died before he could be held accountable for what he had done. But the truth came out. Karen's family finally got answers. And Karen herself was finally brought home. The story of Karen Marie Umphrey is a tragedy. But it's also a testament to the fact that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, no matter how much time has passed, can always be found. It just takes someone willing to look for it. Detective Scott Morrow's investigation into the Marie Umphrey case didn't end with the discovery of her remains. There were still questions that needed answers, and Morrow was determined to find them all. The journal he had found in Gerald Thompson's trailer was a roadmap to decades of violence, and Morrow wanted to make sure that every victim was identified and that every family got the closure they deserved. As Morrow continued to read through Thompson's journal, he realized that Karen was not Thompson's only victim. The journal contained references to at least half a dozen other young women who had disappeared under similar circumstances in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Some of the names Thompson mentioned matched unsolved missing person cases from that era. Others were unidentified, described only by physical characteristics or the locations where Thompson had encountered them. Morrow began cross-referencing the journal entries with cold case files from across Michigan and neighboring states. It was painstaking work, but slowly, patterns began to emerge. In 1977, a 19-year-old woman named Lisa Crawford had disappeared after leaving a bar in Flint, Michigan. Her car was found abandoned, much like Karen's, and she was never seen again. Thompson's journal contained an entry from that same time period describing a woman who matched Lisa's description. In 1979, another young woman, 23-year-old Michelle Hartley, vanished after attending a concert in Detroit. Her case had gone cold almost immediately due to lack of evidence. But Thompson's journal included details about a woman he had followed from a concert venue, details that matched the circumstances of Michelle's disappearance. For each of these cases, Morrow reached out to the investigating agencies, sharing the information he had discovered. In some cases, the original detectives had retired or passed away. In others, the evidence had been lost or destroyed. But in a few instances, there was enough information remaining to reopen the investigations. The Polaroids that Morrow had found in Thompson's trailer were particularly valuable. While not all of the women in the photographs had been identified, some of them matched missing person reports from decades earlier. Families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their daughters, sisters, and friends finally had confirmation of their worst fears. But with that confirmation came a measure of peace. They finally knew. They could finally grieve properly. They could finally lay their loved ones to rest, both literally and figuratively. As word of Morrow's discovery spread through law enforcement communities across the state, other detectives began reaching out to him with their own cold cases, wondering if Gerald Thompson might have been responsible. Morrow found himself at the center of a massive multi-jurisdictional investigation, coordinating with agencies across Michigan and beyond. The sheer scope of Thompson's crimes was staggering. Here was a man who had operated for decades, targeting vulnerable young women, and had managed to evade capture time and time again. Part of the reason he had been so successful was that he was careful. He chose victims who were alone, who had been drinking, who might have made poor decisions about their safety. He struck in different jurisdictions, making it difficult for investigators to connect the cases. And he disposed of bodies in remote locations where they were unlikely to be found. But Thompson had also benefited from something else, the limitations of investigative techniques in the 1970s and 80s. There was no DNA testing. There were no computerized databases linking cases across state lines. Communication between police departments was slow and inefficient. And forensic science was nowhere near as advanced as it is today. In many ways, Thompson was a product of his time, a predator who thrived in an era when the tools to catch him simply didn't exist. But technology had advanced. Investigative techniques had improved. And now, even though Thompson was dead, his crimes were finally being brought to light. Morrow worked with forensic anthropologists to search the locations Thompson had described in his journal. Not all of the searches were successful. Some of the areas had changed dramatically over the years. Construction, development, and natural processes had altered the landscape, making it impossible to pinpoint exact locations. But in several cases, remains were found, and through dental records and DNA testing, victims were identified. Each identification brought a mixture of sorrow and relief to the families involved. They had lived for decades with the uncertainty, the not knowing, the hoping against hope that maybe, somehow, their loved one was still alive somewhere. Now they knew the truth. It was painful, but it was also final. They could finally move forward. One of the most emotional identifications was that of Lisa Crawford, the young woman who had disappeared from Flint in 1977. Her mother, Margaret Crawford, was still alive, living in a nursing home in Detroit. When Morrow visited her to inform her of the discovery, Margaret was 92 years old. She had spent more than 40 years wondering what had happened to her daughter. Morrow sat with Margaret in the quiet of her room and told her everything he had learned. He showed her the journal entry that mentioned Lisa. He explained how Thompson had operated, how he had targeted young women, how he had evaded capture for so long. And he told her that Lisa's remains had been found and positively identified. Margaret cried. She had known, deep down, that Lisa was gone. But hearing it confirmed after all these years was still devastating. Yet there was also a sense of peace in her tears. She finally had an answer. She finally knew what had happened to her little girl. Before Morrow left, Margaret took his hand and thanked him. She told him that she could finally let go, that she could finally stop wondering and start remembering Lisa for who she had been, not for the mystery of her disappearance. It was one of the most powerful moments of Morrow's career, a reminder of why he did this work, of why it mattered to keep digging, to keep searching, to never give up. As the investigation continued, Morrow began to piece together a more complete picture of who Gerald Thompson had been. He wasn't the boogeyman that people imagine when they think of serial killers. He wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows. He was, by all outward appearances, an ordinary man. Thompson had grown up in rural Michigan, the son of a factory worker and a homemaker. His childhood had been unremarkable, at least on the surface. He had attended local schools, played on the high school football team, and graduated with average grades. Those who knew him from those years described him as quiet, somewhat withdrawn, but not particularly unusual. After high school, Thompson had worked a series of blue-collar jobs, factory work, construction, truck driving. He had never married, never had children, and had few close relationships. He lived alone, kept to himself, and generally avoided drawing attention to himself. But beneath that ordinary exterior was something dark, something twisted. Thompson's journal revealed a man who had spent his entire adult life fantasizing about violence, about control, about the domination of women. The journal entries dated back to his early 20s, long before his first known crime. They showed a progression, a gradual escalation from fantasy to action. In his early entries, Thompson wrote about following women, watching them from a distance, imagining what it would be like to have power over them. As time went on, the fantasies became more detailed, more violent. And eventually, he acted on them. Psychologists who reviewed Thompson's journal noted that he exhibited many of the characteristics common to serial offenders. He had a need for control and dominance. He lacked empathy and remorse. He viewed his victims not as human beings, but as objects to be used and discarded. And he was meticulous in his planning, carefully selecting his victims and choosing locations where he was unlikely to be caught. But Thompson also had something else, luck. Time and time again, he had come close to being caught, only to slip away at the last moment. The one time he was arrested, for the attempted abduction in 1976, he had received a relatively light sentence and was released after just 3 years. Had he been given a longer sentence, or had he been more thoroughly investigated, it's possible that many of his later crimes could have been prevented. The question that haunted Morrow, and that haunted many of the other investigators involved in the case, was whether Thompson's crimes could have been stopped sooner. Were there warning signs that were missed? Were there opportunities to catch him that were overlooked? The answer, unfortunately, was yes. There were several points at which Thompson could have been identified as a suspect. The witness who saw a man near Karen's car had given a description that, while vague, was consistent with Thompson's appearance. The receipt found in Karen's car had his name on it. And his criminal history, which included the attempted abduction just a few years earlier, should have made him a person of interest. But the dots were never connected. The receipt was overlooked. The witness description was deemed too vague to be useful. And Thompson's prior arrest, which had occurred in a different county, wasn't flagged during the investigation into Karen's disappearance. It was a series of small failures, individually insignificant, but collectively catastrophic. And it was a reminder of how important it is for law enforcement agencies to communicate and share information, to maintain thorough records, and to never assume that a piece of evidence is too small or too insignificant to matter. In the years since Morrow's investigation, there have been significant improvements in how cold cases are handled. DNA databases have made it possible to link cases across jurisdictions. Digital record keeping has made it easier to search through old case files. And there's a greater awareness of the importance of preserving evidence, even in cases that seem hopeless. But there are still thousands of unsolved cases out there, thousands of families who are waiting for answers. And the lesson of Karen Marie Umphrey's case is that those answers are worth searching for, no matter how much time has passed, no matter how cold the trail has become. Detective Scott Morrow retired from the St. Clair County Sheriff's Department in 2021. But before he left, he made sure that the lessons learned from the Karen Umphrey case were documented and shared with other investigators. He created a training program focused on reviewing cold cases, emphasizing the importance of looking at old evidence with fresh eyes and never assuming that something has been thoroughly investigated just because it's old. Morrow also established a database of unsolved cases from the 1970s and 80s, cross-referencing them with known offenders from that era. The database has already led to several new leads in other cold cases, and it continues to be a valuable resource for investigators across the state. For the family of Karen Marie Umphrey, the resolution of her case brought both pain and peace. They finally knew what had happened to her, finally had closure after nearly 40 years of uncertainty. But that closure came with the knowledge of what Karen had endured in her final hours, and that knowledge was almost too painful to bear. Karen's younger sister, Jennifer Umphrey Miller, became an advocate for victims' families in the years following the resolution of her sister's case. She has spoken at conferences, worked with legislators to improve how cold cases are handled, and has been a voice for those who are still waiting for answers about their own missing loved ones. In an interview conducted several years after Karen's remains were found, Jennifer spoke about the impact that her sister's disappearance had on her family. She described the decades of not knowing, of hoping and fearing in equal measure, of the way the uncertainty had poisoned every holiday, every birthday, every family gathering. But she also spoke about the relief that came with finally knowing the truth. It wasn't the ending they had hoped for. They had always held out hope that maybe, somehow, Karen was still alive somewhere. But at least now they knew. At least now they could grieve properly. At least now they could remember Karen for who she had been, not for the mystery of her disappearance. Jennifer also spoke about her gratitude to Detective Morrow. She described him as a man who had refused to give up, who had cared about Karen even though he had never met her, who had fought for justice long after everyone else had moved on. She credited him with giving her family the closure they so desperately needed. The case of Karen Marie Umphrey also had a profound impact on the man who had been wrongly convicted of her murder. David Payton, who had spent 3 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, had struggled to rebuild his life after his release. The wrongful conviction had cost him his job, his reputation, and years of his life. Even after he was exonerated, there were people in the community who still believed he was guilty. When the truth about Gerald Thompson finally came out, Payton felt a sense of vindication. He had always maintained his innocence, and now, finally, everyone knew he had been telling the truth. But the vindication didn't erase the pain of what he had been through. It didn't give him back the years he had lost. In a statement released through his attorney, Payton expressed relief that Karen's family finally had answers, and anger that the real killer had been allowed to go free for so long. He also called for reforms to the criminal justice system to prevent wrongful convictions like his from happening in the future. Payton's case became a rallying point for advocates of criminal justice reform. It highlighted the dangers of relying too heavily on circumstantial evidence, the problems with eyewitness identification, and the importance of thorough, unbiased investigation. Several legal scholars have written about the Payton case, using it as an example of how the system can fail even when everyone involved is acting in good faith. The story of Karen Marie Umphrey and the investigation that finally brought her home is a complex one, filled with tragedy, failure, persistence, and ultimately, a measure of justice. It's a story that raises difficult questions about how we investigate crimes, how we treat suspects, and how we support the families of victims. But at its core, it's a story about a young woman whose life was stolen from her, and the detective who refused to let her be forgotten. The Polaroid photograph that broke the case open has become something of a symbol in law enforcement circles. It's used in training sessions as an example of why every piece of evidence matters, why nothing should be dismissed as insignificant, and why cold cases should always be reviewed with fresh eyes. That one photograph, taken routinely by an investigator who probably never looked at it twice, contained the clue that would solve the case 40 years later. It's a reminder that justice doesn't have an expiration date. That the truth, no matter how deeply buried, can always be found if someone is willing to look for it. And that every victim deserves to be remembered, to be mourned, and to be brought home. In the years since the resolution of Karen's case, Detective Morrow's work has inspired a new generation of cold case investigators. Police departments across the country have established dedicated cold case units, staffed by detectives who specialize in reviewing old evidence and applying new techniques to unsolved crimes. Advances in DNA technology, forensic science, and criminal databases have made it possible to solve cases that would have been considered hopeless just a few decades ago. But technology alone isn't enough. What makes the difference is investigators like Scott Morrow, people who care enough to spend weeks poring over old case files, who are willing to chase down leads that seem impossibly thin, who refuse to give up even when everyone else has moved on. The community of Port Huron and Smiths Creek has not forgotten Karen Marie Umphrey. In 2020, on the 40th anniversary of her disappearance, a memorial was dedicated in her honor at the local park where she used to play as a child. The memorial features a bronze plaque with Karen's photograph and a brief description of her life, along with the names of other victims of violence from the area. At the dedication ceremony, Jennifer Umphrey Miller spoke to the crowd that had gathered. She talked about Karen's love of music, her devotion to her family, her dreams for the future. She talked about the vibrant, loving person Karen had been, and she urged everyone to remember her not as a victim, but as a daughter, a sister, a friend. Detective Morrow was also present at the dedication. He stood quietly at the back of the crowd, unwilling to take credit for what he considered simply doing his job. But when Jennifer finished speaking, she called him forward and thanked him publicly for everything he had done. The crowd erupted in applause, and Morrow, uncomfortable with the attention, simply nodded and returned to his place at the back. The memorial has become a place where families of other victims come to reflect and remember. It's a reminder that every person who is lost to violence is more than just a statistic, more than just a case file. They were real people with real lives, and they deserve to be remembered. Gerald Thompson's crimes extended far beyond what was documented in his journal. In the years since Morrow's investigation, additional evidence has surfaced linking Thompson to other unsolved cases. Some of these connections have been made through DNA evidence, as investigators have been able to extract genetic material from old evidence and compare it to DNA that Thompson left behind. In 2022, DNA evidence linked Thompson to the 1982 murder of a young woman in Ohio. The victim, 20-year-old Sarah Mitchell, had been found strangled in a wooded area outside of Toledo. Her case had gone cold almost immediately, with no viable suspects and little physical evidence. But when investigators submitted DNA samples from the crime scene to a national database, they got a hit. The DNA matched samples that had been collected from Gerald Thompson's trailer during the investigation into Karen Umphrey's case. The discovery meant that Thompson's hunting ground had been even larger than initially believed. He hadn't just operated in Michigan. He had crossed state lines, expanding his territory and making it even more difficult for investigators to connect his crimes. Similar connections have been made in cases in Indiana and Wisconsin. In each instance, the pattern was the same: young women, alone, targeted in parking lots or on dark streets, their bodies disposed of in remote locations. And in each instance, the cases had gone cold because there simply wasn't enough evidence at the time to identify a suspect. The question that haunts many of the investigators who have worked on these cases is how many other victims there might be. Thompson's journal detailed some of his crimes, but not all of them. There are gaps, periods of time where he wrote vaguely about his activities or didn't write at all. It's possible, even likely, that there are other victims out there who have never been connected to him, families who are still waiting for answers. Some law enforcement agencies have taken a proactive approach, reviewing all unsolved cases of missing or murdered young women from the 1970s and 80s and comparing them to Thompson's known movements and patterns. It's a massive undertaking, one that will likely take years to complete. But for the families of those victims, it's work that needs to be done. The psychological profile of Gerald Thompson that emerged from his journal and from interviews with people who knew him has been studied extensively by criminal psychologists and behavioral analysts. What they've found is a man who was able to compartmentalize his life in a way that allowed him to function normally in society while harboring dark, violent impulses. Thompson held down jobs for years at a time. He paid his bills. He maintained friendships, though they were superficial and never particularly close. To his neighbors and co-workers, he was just a quiet guy who kept to himself. No one suspected that he was capable of the things he did. This ability to blend in, to appear normal, is characteristic of many serial offenders. They don't look like monsters. They don't act like monsters in their everyday lives. They're able to present a facade of normalcy while hiding their true nature. Thompson's journal also revealed that he was aware of his impulses and, on some level, struggled with them. There are entries where he expressed guilt and shame over what he had done, where he wrote about wanting to stop. But those moments of conscience were fleeting. The urges always returned, and when they did, Thompson gave in to them. This internal conflict is something that researchers have observed in other serial offenders. Many of them experience periods where they try to resist their impulses, where they attempt to live normal lives. But for most, the compulsion is too strong. It always wins in the end. In Thompson's case, the impulses continued until he was physically unable to act on them. As he aged and his health declined, he became less mobile, less able to stalk and overpower victims. His journal entries from his later years reflected frustration and anger at his physical limitations. In a perverse way, it was age and infirmity that finally stopped him, not conscience or fear of capture. The impact of Thompson's crimes ripples out far beyond his immediate victims and their families. Each of those young women had friends, co-workers, classmates, people whose lives were touched by their loss. Communities were affected, living with the fear that a predator was among them, even if they didn't know his name. And then there are the secondary victims, people like David Payton, whose life was destroyed by a wrongful conviction, or the investigators who worked Karen's case in the early days and have had to live with the knowledge that they missed crucial evidence. The harm that Thompson caused extends in every direction, touching countless lives. One of the most difficult aspects of the case for many people to process is the fact that Thompson died without ever facing justice. He was never arrested for his crimes. He never stood trial. He never heard the impact statements from the families of his victims. He simply lived out his life and died peacefully in his sleep, never having been held accountable. For some of the families, this is almost unbearable. They wanted to see him in court. They wanted to confront him, to make him hear about the pain he had caused. They wanted to see him convicted and sent to prison, to know that he was suffering even a fraction of what they had suffered. But that opportunity was taken from them, not by Thompson, but simply by time. By the time investigators figured out who he was, it was too late. This is one of the harsh realities of cold case investigations. Sometimes, by the time the truth comes out, the perpetrator is already gone. Justice, in the traditional sense, becomes impossible. The only thing that remains is the truth itself, and the knowledge that the victims have been identified and can finally rest in peace. For Detective Morrow, this was one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. He had worked so hard, had finally uncovered the truth, and yet Thompson would never face consequences. But Morrow also recognized that what he had accomplished was still valuable. He had given the families answers. He had identified victims who might otherwise have remained unknown forever. And he had ensured that Thompson's crimes were documented, that the world knew what he had done. In that sense, justice had been served, even if it wasn't the kind of justice that involves a courtroom and a prison sentence. The story of Karen Marie Umphrey has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries, podcasts, and articles. It has become a well-known case in law enforcement circles and among true crime enthusiasts. But for those who actually knew Karen, who loved her and missed her, she is more than just a story. She is a real person who was taken too soon, who never got to live the life she should have had. Karen was just 21 years old when she died. She was at the beginning of her adult life, with so many possibilities ahead of her. She had dreams and plans and people who loved her. All of that was stolen from her in one terrifying night. Her family has worked hard to ensure that Karen is remembered for who she was, not just for how she died. They've shared photographs of her, stories about her personality, memories of the things she loved. They've painted a picture of a warm, caring person who brought joy to those around her. Jennifer Umphrey Miller has been particularly vocal about this. She has said repeatedly in interviews that she doesn't want Karen to be defined by the violence that ended her life. She wants people to know about Karen's love of music, the way she would dance around the house while doing chores, her terrible jokes that always made her siblings laugh, her fierce protectiveness of her younger brothers and sisters. This is the Karen that Jennifer wants the world to remember. Not the victim in the Polaroid, but the sister who braided her hair and taught her how to ride a bike. The daughter who helped her mother with the groceries and made sure everyone had eaten dinner. The friend who listened without judgment and offered support without being asked. The case has also sparked broader conversations about how we remember victims of violence. There's a tendency in true crime media to focus on the sensational aspects of a case, the gruesome details, the psychology of the killer. And while those things are important for understanding what happened, they can also overshadow the humanity of the victims. Advocates for victims' families have been pushing for a shift in how these stories are told, emphasizing the lives that were lived rather than just the deaths that occurred. They want victims to be remembered as three-dimensional people, not just as plot points in someone else's story. The memorial in Port Huron is part of that effort. It presents Karen as a person first, a victim second. It tells visitors about her life, her family, her community. And while it acknowledges the tragedy of her death, it doesn't dwell on the details. It focuses on celebrating her memory and ensuring that she is not forgotten. In the years since the case was resolved, several books have been written about Karen's story and the investigation that finally brought her home. One of these books, written by a journalist who covered the case extensively, became a bestseller and brought national attention to the story. The book was praised for its sensitive treatment of Karen and her family, and for its thorough examination of the failures that allowed Thompson to evade justice for so long. The book also sparked renewed interest in other cold cases from the same era. Families who had been living with unanswered questions reached out to law enforcement agencies, asking them to take another look at their cases. Some of these requests led to new investigations, and in a few instances, to resolutions. Detective Morrow was interviewed extensively for the book, though he was characteristically modest about his role in solving the case. He insisted that he was simply doing his job, that any competent investigator would have found the same evidence if they had looked hard enough. But those who worked with him know that's not true. Morrow brought a level of dedication and attention to detail that went far beyond what could reasonably be expected. He cared about Karen and her family in a way that drove him to keep searching when most people would have given up. After his retirement, Morrow has continued to work as a consultant on cold cases, offering his expertise to agencies that are struggling with unsolved investigations. He doesn't charge for his services, viewing it as a way to give back and to ensure that other families get the same closure that Karen's family received. He's also become a mentor to younger detectives, teaching them the techniques and approaches that served him so well in the Marie Umphrey case. He emphasizes the importance of questioning assumptions, of looking at evidence from multiple angles, and of never, ever giving up on a victim. One of the detectives he has mentored, a young investigator named Maria Gonzalez, credits Morrow with teaching her everything she knows about cold case investigation. She has gone on to solve several cold cases of her own, using the methods she learned from him. In an interview, she described Morrow as someone who sees the humanity in every case, who never forgets that behind every case file is a real person and a grieving family. The technological advances that have made it possible to solve cases like Karen's continue to evolve. DNA technology has become more sophisticated, able to extract usable genetic material from smaller and more degraded samples. Genetic genealogy, a technique that uses DNA databases to identify relatives of unknown subjects, has been used to solve dozens of cold cases in recent years. Forensic techniques for analyzing digital evidence have also improved dramatically. Investigators can now extract data from old computer hard drives, cell phones, and other electronic devices that might contain crucial evidence. Even devices that were damaged or deliberately wiped can sometimes yield information. And databases have become more comprehensive and more interconnected. Law enforcement agencies across the country can now share information instantaneously, making it much easier to identify patterns and link cases that might be related. But all of these technological tools are only as good as the people using them. They require skilled investigators who know how to interpret the data, who understand the limitations of the technology, and who are willing to put in the long hours necessary to follow every lead. The Marie Umphrey case is a perfect example of this. The evidence that solved the case had been there all along. The Polaroid existed in the case file for 40 years. The receipt with Thompson's name on it was recovered from Karen's car in 1980. The technology to read the handwriting and trace the name was available even back then. What was missing wasn't technology. It was someone who cared enough to look closely at that photograph, someone who was willing to dig through old evidence boxes in a storage facility, someone who refused to accept that the case was unsolvable. That someone was Scott Morrow. And because of him, Marie Umphrey finally got justice. The case has also had a lasting impact on how evidence is preserved and catalogued. In the wake of the investigation, the St. Clair County Sheriff's Department implemented new protocols for evidence storage, ensuring that nothing gets lost or overlooked. Every piece of evidence is now photographed, logged into a digital database, and stored in a climate-controlled facility where it can be easily accessed. These protocols have been adopted by law enforcement agencies across Michigan and beyond. They represent a recognition that cases don't always get solved immediately, that sometimes it takes decades for the right piece of evidence to be recognized for what it is. Other agencies have also established regular review processes for cold cases, ensuring that every unsolved case gets looked at periodically by fresh eyes. These reviews have led to breakthroughs in numerous cases, as new investigators have spotted details that earlier investigators missed. The lesson is clear: persistence matters. Attention to detail matters. And every victim deserves to have their case reviewed, no matter how much time has passed. For the community of Port Huron and Smiths Creek, the resolution of Karen's case brought a mix of emotions. There was relief that the mystery had finally been solved, that the person responsible had been identified. But there was also anger and sadness that it had taken so long, that so many years had been wasted, that Thompson had been allowed to continue his crimes unchecked. There were also difficult conversations about the wrongful conviction of David Payton. How had the system failed so badly? How had an innocent man been convicted on such flimsy evidence? And what could be done to prevent similar miscarriages of justice in the future? These conversations led to reforms in how the county handles criminal investigations. Prosecutors are now required to turn over all evidence to the defense, not just the evidence they plan to use at trial. Eyewitness identification procedures have been improved to reduce the risk of misidentification. And there's greater scrutiny of forensic evidence, with independent experts reviewing findings before they're presented in court. These changes came too late to help David Payton, but they may prevent future wrongful convictions. And that's something, at least. The story of Karen Marie Umphrey is, in many ways, a microcosm of the broader challenges facing our criminal justice system. It highlights the importance of thorough investigation, the dangers of rushing to judgment, the value of preserving evidence, and the need for persistence in seeking the truth. But more than that, it's a reminder that behind every cold case is a human being who deserves justice, a family that deserves answers, and a community that deserves to feel safe. Karen Marie Umphrey was a real person. She had hopes and dreams. She had people who loved her. And she deserved better than what happened to her on that cold November night in 1980. Thanks to the determination of one detective who refused to give up, Karen's story didn't end with her disappearance. It didn't end with a wrongful conviction. It didn't end with her case going cold. It ended with the truth. And while that truth was painful, while it didn't bring Karen back, it did bring her home. It gave her family closure. It identified her killer. And it ensured that Karen would be remembered not just as a victim, but as a person. That one Polaroid photograph, overlooked for 40 years, changed everything. It proved that no detail is too small, no case is too cold, and no victim should ever be forgotten. This is the legacy of Karen Marie Umphrey. This is why her story matters. And this is why we must never stop fighting for justice, no matter how much time has passed. The case of Karen Marie Umphrey stands as a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of never giving up, and the truth that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be achieved. Detective Scott Morrow's investigation didn't just solve one case. It opened doors to solving multiple cases, brought closure to numerous families, and changed the way cold cases are approached across the country. But perhaps most importantly, it reminded us all that every victim matters, that every case deserves to be investigated thoroughly, and that the passage of time doesn't diminish our obligation to seek the truth. Karen Marie Umphrey finally got to go home. After 40 years, she was finally laid to rest, surrounded by family and friends who never forgot her. Her killer was identified, his crimes exposed, and his other victims given the recognition they deserved. It wasn't the ending anyone wanted. But it was the ending that Karen and her family deserved. And that one tiny detail in an old Polaroid photograph, the detail that everyone had overlooked for 40 years, was the key that unlocked it all. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you for honoring Karen's memory by listening. Cases like hers remind us why this work matters, why we can't give up on cold cases, and why every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, leave a comment letting us know your thoughts, and subscribe to Cold Case Room so you never miss another story of justice delayed but not denied. These families need their stories told, and your support helps us continue bringing these cases to light. Justice for Karen. Justice for all the victims who are still waiting. Until next time, this is Cold Case Room.